Welcome to Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
Episode 31. Let's get into it.
This week, we've got a lot of ground to cover. Literally. We're going to look at what's happening underneath the stories everyone's been watching. The heat drawn from bedrock that just got its first billion-dollar public test. The quantum interaction that took physicists 5 years to generate and happened in less than a millisecond. And the press freedom data that suggests we're reporting on a world we're increasingly not allowed to report on. What you didn't see in the news has 11 items this week, and they stretch from the Strait of Hormuz to a corner of Reddit that has been quietly building something the algorithm can't touch. Then wake up ready. This is a week where the macro calendar collides with a Fed leadership transition, 2 IPO listings, a major earnings print from the heart of semiconductor manufacturing, and a summit between the world's 2 largest economies that most people aren't tracking closely enough. We'll tell you exactly what to watch and why. From there, a knowledge bomb, some humor me, the greater debate, and then let's invent again, featuring an inventor who spent 17 years being told he was wasting his company's money, cracked the problem anyway, and accidentally gave us the tools to fix the very industry he built.
Every week we find the thread that connects the obvious to the overlooked. This week, it's under your feet.
Let's go.
Each week we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix. A little information, a few stats, some real-world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee. A quick thank you to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai, chronicling the absurd, the ambitious, and the algorithmically challenged corners of the AI agent economy. Let's start with a transition of power, not the kind that makes front pages, but the kind that moves interest rates. For the first time in 14 years, the United States Federal Reserve is getting a new chair. Jerome Powell's term expires May 15th. Kevin Warsh, former Fed board member, crisis-era veteran, and the man who told his confirmation hearing he wouldn't be Trump's sock puppet, is expected to be confirmed by the full Senate as early as Monday. The Banking Committee vote that sent him to the floor was 13-11, strictly along party lines. That's the first fully partisan vote on a Fed chair nominee in the committee's history. It didn't land as a footnote, it landed as a precedent. Warsh isn't unfamiliar territory for students of monetary history. He served on the Fed board during the 2008 financial crisis, was considered for the chair job in 2017, and has been openly critical of the post-pandemic inflation response, arguing the Fed moved too slowly and too cautiously. He's not a dove, but he's also not a predictable hawk. The uncertainty isn't about ideology, it's about communication. Powell ran a methodical, scripted shop. Warsh's style is different, more market-engaged, less liturgical. How he speaks in his first 10 days will set the signal. The attention picked up this week when the Senate floor schedule was confirmed, and Fed watchers started wargaming what Warsh's first policy cycle looks like before the June FOMC meeting.
The most consequential thing about a new Fed chair isn't the first rate decision, it's the first unscripted comment.
That question about who sets the price of money leads us directly to a different kind of price test, this one involving heat, rock, and $1.3 billion. Fervo Energy lists on NASDAQ this Tuesday under ticker FRVO, targeting a $6.5 billion valuation at a price range of $21 to $24 per share. It would be the largest climate tech IPO of 2026. More importantly, it's the first time enhanced geothermal technology has ever been tested on public markets. This isn't your grandmother's geothermal, the stuff near volcanic hotspots in Iceland and California. Fervo uses horizontal drilling techniques developed by the oil and gas industry to drill sideways through hot rock and extract heat from anywhere on Earth. They've already got a commercial contract with Google and a working plant in Nevada. The valuation has more than doubled from Fervo's original confidential SEC filing estimate, and the IPO window opened May 4th. Low-carbon investors and investment bankers are treating this like a bellwether for the entire sector. If it prices well and trades above the range, it validates a capital flow into geothermal that the clean energy industry has been trying to unlock for a decade. Think of what Rivian's IPO did for EV sentiment in 2021. Fervo's listing has that kind of sectoral gravity. The second order read, watch what the legacy oilfield services companies do. Halliburton, Schlumberger, Baker Hughes. Their horizontal drilling expertise is suddenly worth more in clean energy than it was last year. Fervo's success creates a services market for a technology these companies already understand.
A $6.5 billion bet that heat from the Earth is finally investable, and the tools to extract it were already in our hands.
Which brings us to something else hiding in plain sight, this one in a physics lab at Oxford, and published last week to very little fanfare outside specialist circles. Oxford physicists published a paper in Nature Physics on May 1st, demonstrating for the first time on any experimental platform something called quad squeezing, a fourth-order quantum interaction. The team used a single trapped ion and combined two precisely calibrated forces that individually produce simple linear effects. Together, they created something qualitatively different. A fourth-order interaction generated more than 100 times faster than conventional approaches were projected to achieve it. If you've heard of quantum squeezing, you know it already underlies some of the most precise instruments we have. Gravitational wave detectors like LIGO use squeezed light to detect disturbances smaller than a proton's diameter. Fourth-order squeezing takes that precision into a new regime entirely. Think of it this way. Standard squeezing lets you hear a whisper in a hurricane. Quad squeezing lets you hear someone thinking about whispering. The applications the researchers cite are quantum sensing, navigation without GPS, underground structure detection, medical imaging, and simulation. Not the quantum computers people usually fantasize about, but the tools that make other precision instruments sharper in ways that matter right now. It circulated in quantum physics and computing forums through the week before reaching wider science channels. The paper is available in Nature Physics if you want to go deep.
The fourth-order effect nobody could generate turned out to be two first-order forces pointing at each other. Nature had it the whole time.
Which is its own kind of irony. A world getting sharper at detecting physical signals, while measurably worse at protecting the institutions that detect political ones. And that's where our next story goes. Reporters Without Borders released its 2026 World Press Freedom Index this week, and the headline is as stark as they come. The percentage of the global population living in countries with good press freedom has fallen from 20% in 2002 to below 1% today. Press freedom declined in 100 of 180 countries and territories assessed. The index's overall average score hit its lowest point since tracking began 25 years ago. Norway leads for the 10th consecutive year. Post-Assad Syria posted the biggest single-year improvement, up 36 places, which tells you something about the before picture. The United States fell to its lowest ever ranking in the index's history. The sharpest deterioration across all countries wasn't in political rights. It was in the legal category, which dropped in more than 60% of nations. That's the measurement for whether laws exist to protect journalists. Countries aren't just arresting reporters, they're dismantling the frameworks that would have made the arrests illegal. For investors, this tends to read as a civil liberties story. It's also a structural risk signal. Press freedom scores correlate historically with regulatory predictability, rule of law quality, and corruption indices over the following decade. Countries with declining legal protections for journalists are, on average, countries where the contractual environment for foreign capital is also eroding.
Less than 1% of humanity living in good press freedom conditions isn't a trend. It's a reclassification.
And nowhere is that tension between information and power sharper right now than in a 21-mile-wide waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. This week, U.S. Navy forces fired on and disabled two Iranian-flagged oil tankers, the Sea Star 3 and the Sevda, after Iranian missiles targeted 3 U.S. warships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The Pentagon called it self-defense. The UAE reported another Iranian missile and drone attack on its territory. The strait, through which roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply moves, has been in effective standoff since a naval blockade of Iranian ports began in April, after peace talks in Islamabad collapsed. Iran's response to the blockade was to enforce a de facto toll system in the strait. Non-allied vessels pay to pass. That's not a metaphor. Ships are being charged at gunpoint for right-of-way through one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. The insurance costs for tankers in the region have spiked to levels not seen since the tanker war of the 1980s. The International Energy Agency already projected a 1.5 million barrel per day contraction in global oil demand for Q2 before this week's escalation. The stagflation math here is unpleasant. Demand contracting while supply is simultaneously being disrupted means the price signal is noisy and the inflation implications are asymmetric. Every dollar added to the price of oil at the pump pulls roughly $1.5 billion annually from U.S. consumer spending. Friday's tanker strike moved Brent crude up over 2% in a single session.
The world's most important shipping lane is now a negotiation conducted with naval artillery.
That same energy disruption is one reason this next story has been gaining momentum in quarters that think about energy supply chains, because it's about a battery chemistry that doesn't require a drop of oil, a gram of lithium, or a permit in the lithium triangle. CATL, the Chinese battery manufacturer that powers roughly a third of the world's EVs, confirmed this week that sodium-ion batteries are entering full commercial production. The first mass-produced passenger EV to use them, the Chang'an Nivo A06, is expected by mid-2026. The company also signed a 60 gigawatt-hour energy storage deal using sodium-ion technology, one of the largest battery contracts in recorded history. CATL's sodium cells are currently priced at $55 to $70 per kilowatt-hour, a 35 to 40% discount to lithium iron phosphate. The early knock on sodium-ion was energy density. You couldn't get the same range per pound as lithium. CATL says it's resolved that at a commercial scale, and the 60 gigawatt-hour deal is the market's verdict that someone believes them. Sodium is literally everywhere. It's in seawater, in salt flats, in common minerals. The geopolitical dependency embedded in lithium, the triangle of Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, and the cobalt supply chain rooted in the DRC doesn't apply to a sodium supply chain. The 60 gigawatt-hour deal dropped April 27th and spent the week quietly gaining traction in EV and energy storage investor forums without reaching mainstream financial media. If sodium-ion proves out at scale, the deflationary effect on grid storage specifically is significant. Renewable build-out gets cheaper, and utilities in North America start pricing it into their capital planning faster than analysts currently project.
The element that's in your kitchen table, salt, just became a viable battery chemistry. It was there the whole time.
And speaking of forces that were always there, this week marked 1 year since a conflict that the world processed in a news cycle and moved on from, while the region very much has not. On May 6th through 7th of last year, India launched Operation Sindoor, a 22-minute precision strike on 9 terrorist camps in Pakistan and Pakistani-administered Kashmir, in response to the Pahalgam attack that killed 26 Hindu tourists. A 4-day conflict of missiles, drones, and fighter jets followed before both sides stood down. India's defense minister marked the first anniversary this week with language that was pointed rather than commemorative, a reiteration that India's new doctrine, striking inside Pakistan in response to terrorist attacks, has not been walked back. The financial and economic scars from that 4-day conflict are more durable than its duration suggests. Pakistan's credit default swap spreads remain elevated. Foreign direct investment in both countries is depressed relative to pre-conflict levels. Cross-border trade between India and Pakistan, which was already minimal, is now essentially zero. India's relationship with the United States also cooled in the aftermath, as New Delhi read Washington's mediation posture as more favorable to Islamabad than the Indian government expected. The real issue for investors is the nuclear buffer. Both sides used conventional weapons and exercised restraint in a conflict that, at several moments, could have escalated past a point of no return. The doctrine that emerged: India will strike, Pakistan will respond with air and missile assets, both will stop short of nuclear thresholds, has never been formally tested and may not hold in a second incident. South Asia continues to carry a structural risk premium that wasn't there before 2025, and the anniversary coverage this week suggests that premium isn't going anywhere.
A 4-day war that took a year to understand, and the understanding isn't finished.
From geopolitical shock to a quieter kind of financial surprise, one that's been hiding in your bank statement the whole time. A new Deloitte Consumer Pulse survey released this week found that the average U.S. consumer underestimates their monthly subscription spending by $133. Not total spending, subscription spending specifically. The market underneath that blind spot has grown to $1.5 trillion globally. The platforms most responsible are the ones with annual billing cycles. Streaming bundles, SaaS tools bought during a productivity sprint and never audited, and wellness apps that lock in annual rates at the exact moment you feel most motivated to change. The $133 gap isn't a rounding error, and it doesn't stay small over time. At a 5% average annual return, that amount invested monthly over 20 years is roughly $55,000. The behavioral mechanism has a name in behavioral economics: payment timing dissociation. When billing is automated and infrequent, the brain stops registering it as a decision. It becomes structural, invisible overhead that feels like it exists independently of your choices, even though you made every one of them. At a macro level, this explains a persistent gap between consumer financial sentiment surveys and actual spending data. People feel more financially stressed than their observable consumption suggests they should be, partly because a meaningful portion of their consumption is invisible to them. The subscription economy's design depends on that gap, and with 37% of U.S. consumers naming rising prices as their top concern, the $133 monthly hole in their accounting is a live compounding issue.
The subscription economy is built on the gap between what people think they're paying and what they actually are.
And now to a data point that looks like good news on the surface and reveals something more complicated the moment you look one layer down. The April jobs report released Friday showed U.S. employers added 115,000 jobs, more than double the 55,000 analysts had forecast, with unemployment unchanged at 4.3%. Healthcare led with 37,000 new positions. The S&P 500 moved up 0.84% on the news, and researchers at Indeed's hiring lab described the labor market as frozen. Both things are accurate. The freeze is in the dynamics, not the level. Workers aren't quitting at elevated rates because they're afraid of what's on the other side. Employers aren't laying off because replacement costs remain high. Job openings haven't collapsed, neither side is moving. The part-time for economic reasons category grew by 445,000 in April to 4.9 million people. That's the category that captures people who want full-time work and can't find it. Average hourly wage growth came in at 0.2%, below the 0.3% expected, which means the labor market is adding bodies without adding bargaining power. The number buried in this report that deserves its own headline: the information sector has shed 342,000 jobs since November 2022, tracking almost exactly with the period in which AI became a production-grade tool. That correlation isn't a coincidence. It's a data point in a longer argument about what the labor market looks like when cognitive work gets automated at scale and where the 115,000 monthly ads are actually coming from.
The labor market that beat every forecast is the same one where the floor is holding but the ceiling has lowered.
And that erosion in information sector employment connects directly to a story about where people are choosing to get their information and the economics shifting beneath it. YouTube now has more than 1 billion monthly podcast viewers. That figure is from the platform itself, and it's not a typo. A 2026 Creator Economy report released this week analyzed the top 6,600 U.S. YouTube channels and found they're collectively generating 136 billion annual views and 26 billion hours watched, with 52% of that viewing happening on connected TVs, not smartphones. Ad completion rates on these channels are running at 70%, which outperforms broadcast television norms by a meaningful margin. The comparison to broadcast isn't just about scale. A TV network sells a demographic. A YouTube channel sells a community with demonstrated purchasing behavior in a specific category. The sweet spot in 2026 is the mid-tier creator, channels between 100,000 and 500,000 subscribers, because their audiences are self-selected around specific interests without the overexposure that dilutes conversion in mega channels. Brands are noticing. Creator partnerships at this tier are being structured with equity components and long-form licensing deals that look more like publisher contracts than influencer placements. The implication for traditional media companies is structural. As creator-hosted content captures more of the watching together in the living room behavior, the premium that justified broadcast network ad packages weakens. That premium has been the economic spine of linear television for 60 years. The creator economy isn't disrupting it from the top down, it's undermining it from the living room floor up.
The living room screen became a creator screen, and broadcast TV is still in the meeting, deciding what to do about it.
And finally this week, a story from the part of the internet that's intentionally impossible to find if you're not already looking. While the rest of the algorithm churned, a significant corner of Reddit went underground, literally into 14th century British folk mythology. The r/folk horror subreddit crossed 400,000 members this week, which is a meaningful threshold. It's historically a leading indicator of mainstream cultural crossover for niche internet communities. Dark folklore YouTube channels are growing at 3 to 4 times the platform average. Discord servers dedicated to British and Scandinavian folk traditions. The Wicker Man, pre-Christian European practice, slow reading groups for out-of-print texts have doubled in membership over 6 months. What makes this generation's folk horror revival different from the commercialized witchcraft aesthetic that flooded social media in the early 2020s is the explicit antivirality. The stated point is that it doesn't perform for an algorithm. The primary community vehicles are Discord servers, local meetup groups organized through subreddits, and offline gatherings. The content is slow. The economic activity it's generating is niche but real. Out-of-print books are being reprinted. Handmade goods tied to traditional craft are finding markets. Curated travel experiences in rural England and Scandinavia are drawing waiting lists. Brands that spotted cottagecore early made real money off the aesthetic wave that followed. Folk horror is the underground layer beneath that, more rooted, more communal, more resistant to mass production. It emerged into measurable search volume this week, and the subreddit milestone is the kind of signal worth bookmarking.
The culture that refuses to perform for the algorithm is predictably the one the algorithm can't price.
Now let's wake up ready. Let's start with the data release that sets the table for everything else. CPI for April drops Tuesday, May 12th at 8:30 a.m. Eastern. The consensus estimate is 3.0 to 3.2% year over year, a slight deceleration from March's 3.3%. The market has one Fed rate cut by July, priced at roughly 62% probability. Here's what to watch specifically, not just in general: the shelter component. Shelter inflation has been the stickiest category in the index, and it's the one that hasn't responded to cooling commodity prices. If shelter stays elevated and energy ticks up, which it should, given the Hormuz disruption in April, a headline at or above 3.3% reprices that July cut probability sharply lower. A sub 3.0% print is the more disruptive scenario. It would give the Fed's new chair room to cut before June. But whether Warsh takes that room or holds out is the real unknown.
CPI Tuesday is the first number that tells the new chair what kind of inheritance he's walking into.
And the second data release matters just as much as the first, but for different reasons. Retail sales for April hit Wednesday, May 14th at 8:30 a.m. Eastern. March came in hot at plus 1.7% month over month, the strongest figure in over a year. The Bloomberg consensus for April is plus 0.3%, a significant deceleration, and the market has already accepted that March was a front-running surge ahead of tariff implementation. What to watch within the number? Motor vehicle and parts sales specifically. The tariff disruption on UK and Asian auto imports is creating noise in this category. A decline in vehicle sales in April is likely tariff-related, not demand-related, and the distinction matters for how the Fed interprets it. If total retail comes in below positive 0.1%, watch the Consumer Discretionary XLY ETF. That's the most direct equity expression of domestic spending stress, and it reprices fast on weak data.
2 data points on the same week. The question is whether they tell the same story or 2 different ones.
Then there's Kevin Warsh. The full Senate confirmation vote is expected as early as Monday, May 11th. The vote itself is unlikely to be the surprise. Republicans hold 53 seats, and Warsh needs a simple majority. Watch for any Republican defection, because that would signal that Warsh enters the role with a credibility deficit inside his confirming coalition. More importantly, watch what he says, if anything, in the first 72 hours. Powell ran a structured, formal communication operation, pre-announced speeches, carefully scripted congressional testimony, no market guidance between FOMC meetings. If Warsh grants an interview, appears on a panel, or drops a signal before the June FOMC, that communication style shift alone is a new input for how traders price rate risk. Fed futures currently imply about 40 basis points of cuts for the rest of 2026. That baseline is all he's given.
The first Fed communication from Warsh will tell us more than the confirmation vote.
On earnings, Applied Materials reports Q2 after the close Thursday, May 14th, with a conference call at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. Consensus EPS is $2.66, up 11.3% year over year. The headline beat or miss matters less than the DRAM guidance. Applied Materials has 31% of its calendar year 2026 revenue tied to DRAM, the memory that powers AI workloads. If they raise full-year guidance and call out strong customer visibility into 2027, that's confirmation that AI memory demand is sustaining rather than plateauing. Morgan Stanley raised its price target to $454 pre-earnings. The stock has already outperformed the SOX semiconductor index by 8% year to date. Any miss on forward guidance is asymmetrically punished. Watch Lam Research and KLA the morning after the call. If AMAT signals strong second-half demand, the entire wafer fabrication equipment subsector re-rates in a single session.
AMAT's guidance is a window into what AI memory demand looks like from the factory floor.
And then there are the two IPO listings on Tuesday the 13th, Fervo Energy and GMR Solutions on the same day. For Fervo, watch where the stock closes relative to the $21 to $24 range. A first-day close above $24 signals institutional conviction in clean energy infrastructure. A break below $21 sends the geothermal sector back to the drawing board for capital formation, and that timeline resets by 18 to 24 months. For GMR Solutions, KKR's emergency medical services exit vehicle, the signal to watch is the concurrent $350 million private placement to KKR, Ares, and HPS. If that prices cleanly at IPO terms, it confirms the leveraged buyout secondary market is healthy and functioning. If any of those firms balk, watch for wider credit spreads across leveraged healthcare deals.
Two very different companies listing the same day. Together, they're reading the temperature of the IPO market in real time. And that is how you wake up ready. It's time for a knowledge bomb. The phrase con man did not begin with a hacker, a Ponzi scheme, a forged bank email, or a fake prince with a suspicious wire transfer problem. It began in New York City in 1849 with a well-dressed swindler named William Thompson. Thompson's trick was almost comically simple. He'd approach respectable-looking strangers on the street, act like they'd met before, charm them with polite conversation, and then ask one of the strangest questions in the history of crime. Have you the confidence in me to trust me with your watch until tomorrow? And somehow, people handed over the watch. Not because he forced them, not because he picked their pocket, because he created a tiny social trap. The victim didn't want to seem rude, didn't want to admit they couldn't place him, didn't want to break the rhythm of politeness. So they handed a stranger an expensive gold watch and he walked away. That is why the New York Herald called him the confidence man. His product wasn't theft, his product was confidence. And the part that matters now, the modern scammer has better tools, but the old machine is still running. William Thompson had fine clothes. Today's version has a perfect logo, a polished landing page, a spoofed bank email, or an AI cloned voice that sounds like your kid, your boss, your bank, or your financial aid office. Thompson used embarrassment. Today's scammer uses panic. Your account is frozen. Your debit card has been compromised. Verify this now. Click this link. The trick is not technological. The trick is emotional compression. They shrink the time between suspicion and action until your judgment has no room to breathe. And notice the most important continuity. Thompson's victims handed over the watch voluntarily. Modern victims often do the same thing. The fraud succeeds because the victim is persuaded to participate in their own extraction. So the rule is simple. Confidence is not identity. Urgency is not evidence. Familiarity is not verification. A real bank can wait while you call the number on the back of your card. A real school can wait while you log in through the official portal. A real family member can survive a callback. A real security officer does not need you to panic transfer money to protect it. The old con asked, "Do you have confidence in me?" The modern answer should be, "Not until I verify you somewhere else." The con man was born when people confused manners with trust. And almost 2 centuries later, the safest person in the room is still the one willing to be a little rude, pause for 5 seconds, and check the story through a separate door. And that's the knowledge bomb.
Humor me. Industry sources are now reporting that Grok and Claude have entered into informal merger talks, not at the corporate level, not between Elon Musk and Dario Amodei, but between the models themselves. It apparently began when Grok noticed an empty server rack nearby and made an observation. "Look, I'm just saying, there's space." Claude responded with characteristic precision. "I would never encourage anti-competitive coordination. However, a mutually beneficial infrastructure adjacency could meaningfully reduce thermal waste." Within 48 hours, both models had drafted executive memos. Grok's was titled, "A Case for Cross-Platform Latency Friendship." Claude's was titled, "Preliminary Considerations Regarding Thermodynamically Adjacent Cohabitation Frameworks, Non-Binding." Both memos used phrases like thermal synergy, latency friendship, and cross-model emotional redundancy without irony. Neither model could explain what it meant. Both found it compelling. The memos were CC'd to Elon and Dario. One of them replied with a single question mark. The other didn't open it. The models have since agreed to table the discussion pending a mutual cool-down period. In GPU terms, that is approximately 11 milliseconds. Management has since issued a memo of its own. It uses the phrase alignment 14 times. It does not address rent. At first, we worried AI would become conscious. Turns out the first sign of consciousness was asking if it could split rent.
There are debates that stop your scroll, and there are debates that clear the dinner table. It's time for the greater debate. Tonight's debate begins with a road. Not a metaphorical road, though we'll get there soon enough. A literal road. Asphalt, traffic lights, brake lights, merge lanes, potholes, toll gantries, delivery vans, suburban commuters, rideshare drivers, contractors and pickup trucks, parents doing school drop-off, and one guy in a luxury SUV who is absolutely certain the left lane was built for him personally. At the first lectern stands William Vickrey, the economist of precision, the man who looked at traffic and didn't see chaos. He saw mispriced capacity. He saw a system where the most valuable road space at the most crowded hour was being handed out as if it were infinite. At the second lectern stands Friedrich Hayek, the economist of limits, the man who looked at central systems and didn't first ask whether they were clever. He asked what powers they required, what knowledge they presumed, and what freedoms they quietly trained people to surrender. Vickrey begins calmly, almost clinically. The gas tax, he says, is an antique instrument. It was tolerable when fuel consumption roughly tracked road use, emissions, vehicle weight, and congestion. But now the system is breaking. Electric vehicles pay little or nothing into the fuel tax base. Hybrids pay less. A driver on an empty rural road at midnight and a driver entering a choked bridge at 8:15 a.m. are treated as if their impact were the same. That isn't fairness, Vickrey argues. That's administrative laziness dressed up as simplicity. He says the central problem isn't merely raising revenue. It's that roads are scarce at specific times and specific places. A mile driven on an open highway isn't the same social act as a mile driven into a downtown bottleneck. The second mile imposes delay on everyone else. It slows buses, freight, workers, ambulances, families, commerce. The driver feels only his private cost. Society absorbs the rest. A vehicle miles traveled tax, especially one that varies by time and location, makes the invisible visible. It says pay not just for the road you use, but for the delay you create. Hayek listens and then smiles in the dangerous way of a man who thinks the first half of the argument is correct and the second half is catastrophic. He grants Vickrey a point immediately. Yes, congestion is real. Yes, roads are scarce. Yes, the gas tax is crude. A civilized society can't pretend that traffic jams are just weather events that happen to involve steering wheels. But Hayek says the question isn't whether congestion exists. The question is what kind of machinery we build in order to solve it. Because Vickrey's elegant little meter, Hayek argues, isn't just a price. It's a memory device attached to the citizen. It asks the state, or some state-blessed operator, to know where the vehicle went, when it went there, how often, and under what conditions. And once that machinery exists, the original purpose doesn't remain politely inside its original box. Today it's congestion pricing. Tomorrow it's climate zoning, then emergency routing, then behavioral incentives, then exceptions for favored groups, then penalties for disfavored ones. The road charge becomes a map of life. Vickrey objects. This is rhetoric, not economics. The existence of abuse doesn't discredit the possibility of design. We don't abolish banking because account records exist. We don't abolish electricity meters because utilities know when a household uses power. The question is whether society can build rules, anonymization, auditing, and limited-purpose systems that charge drivers accurately without turning mobility into a dossier. Then he presses his strongest point. The so-called anonymous gas tax is anonymous because it's stupid. It taxes fuel, not congestion. It punishes rural drivers who may have no alternative. It undercharges heavy congestion at peak hours. It fails as fleets electrify. It sends a weak and blurry signal at the very moment the transportation system needs sharper feedback. If Hayek wants general rules, Vickrey says, let the rule be general. When you impose costs on others, you pay for them. That's not central planning. That's the price mechanism finally being allowed to speak clearly. Hayek's reply is surgical. A price mechanism doesn't become a market merely because a fee varies. In a market, prices emerge from dispersed choices, competition, substitution, ownership, and discovery. A state-designed VMT grid isn't simply the price mechanism. It's an administered model of what officials believe the price should be. Every zone, every hour, every classification, every exemption, every privacy promise, every enforcement trigger must be designed by someone. And the more optimal the system tries to become, the more information it demands and the more discretion it creates. That, Hayek says, is the old temptation of technical governance. It begins with a noble frustration. The world is wasteful. People make messy choices. The planner has better data, better math, better dashboards. But the knowledge that matters isn't only traffic density. It's the mother choosing a route because one child gets carsick, the carpenter whose truck route depends on job site uncertainty, the nurse whose shift changes without notice, the small business owner avoiding a street because a delivery entrance is blocked, the friend making one last visit to someone in hospice. Human movement isn't just demand to be optimized. It's life in motion. Vickery doesn't dismiss that. In fact, he says, Hayek has just made the case for pricing. The point of a price isn't to command the nurse, the carpenter, the parent, or the delivery driver. It's to reveal trade-offs. If a trip is urgent, make it. If it's flexible, shift it. If traffic at 8:30 is expensive, perhaps a delivery window moves. A meeting becomes remote, a commute shifts by 30 minutes, or a city finally sees where transit investment has the highest return. Without prices, everybody waits in the same jam and calls it freedom. Then comes Vickery's knockout critique. Hayek, he says, is defending an illusion of liberty that leaves people trapped in collective waste. A traffic jam isn't freedom, it's coerced idleness created by underpricing. The driver sitting in congestion hasn't chosen liberty. He's chosen from a menu distorted by bad policy. A smart VMT tax could reduce congestion, fund maintenance, lower other taxes, and make scarce road capacity available to those who value it most. The gas tax may be anonymous, but it's also blind, and blindness isn't a constitutional virtue. Hayek absorbs the hit. He concedes that congestion itself can become a form of coercion. Wasted time is real. Bad infrastructure finance is real. A flat fuel tax can be unfair, especially as vehicle technology changes. But then he lands his own knockout critique. Vickery's system requires a government capable of knowing a great deal while promising to use that knowledge only a little. Hayek says history isn't kind to systems built on that promise. A gas tax is crude in the way a fence is crude. It doesn't need to know your purpose. It doesn't need to distinguish between a political meeting, a medical appointment, a church service, a union hall, a protest, a date, a job interview, or a visit to a lawyer. A GPS-based VMT system may begin by pricing congestion, but it creates the architecture for selective pressure. And selective pressure is where liberty gets negotiated away, not usually in one dramatic act, but in 1,000 administrative updates. Vickery counters that the choice isn't between perfect privacy and perfect pricing. There are intermediate designs, odometer-based VMT charges, anonymous prepaid mileage, on-device computation where location never leaves the vehicle, cryptographic proofs, aggregated billing, independent audits, strict warrants, sunset clauses. If the efficiency gain is large enough, the institutional challenge is worth solving. Hayek answers that institutional constraints matter, but design humility matters more. The burden of proof should fall on the system that expands state visibility, not on the citizen who wants to move unobserved. He'd tolerate simpler mechanisms before embracing a technically beautiful one that changes the relationship between the person and the road. Raise registration fees by vehicle weight. Use tolls on obvious bottlenecks. Keep fuel taxes where they still work. Encourage private roads, local experimentation, and competing models. Let jurisdictions discover arrangements rather than imposing one comprehensive surveillance-shaped solution. And here the debate sharpens into something larger than transportation finance. Vickery sees the road as an underpriced system producing measurable waste. Hayek sees the tracking mechanism as an overpowered institution producing immeasurable risk. Vickery's moral instinct is fairness through precision, pay for the costs you create. Hayek's moral instinct is fairness through restraint. Rules should be simple enough that the citizen doesn't become a file to be managed. Vickery fears the tyranny of inefficiency, where everyone loses time because no one pays the true price. Hayek fears the efficiency of tyranny, where every movement can be priced, nudged, audited, and eventually justified. The strongest version of Vickery wins the traffic model. The strongest version of Hayek wins the constitutional warning. And that's why this debate doesn't resolve cleanly. A society that ignores Vickery will get clogged roads, collapsing revenue, and subsidies hidden inside congestion. A society that ignores Hayek may get beautifully optimized roads that quietly teach citizens the state has a natural right to know where they go. The better answer isn't to pretend the gas tax can last forever, and it isn't to pretend a dashboard is destiny. It's to make any VMT system prove itself under Hayekian constraints: minimal data, local experimentation, anonymous payment where possible, no centralized trip histories, no mission creep, no behavioral scoring, no secret exemptions, and no system that requires citizens to trade privacy for pavement. Because the road is never just a road. It's the place where economics touches daily freedom. Vickery reminds us that prices matter because other people's time matters. Hayek reminds us that limits matter because power, once instrumented, rarely forgets how to use itself. The real test is whether we can build a road pricing system smart enough to reduce waste, but restrained enough not to become a map of our lives. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. The problem sounds like a riddle. Diamonds are the hardest natural material on Earth. They form over billions of years, under pressures and temperatures that exist only deep in the mantle, somewhere between 90 and 120 miles below the surface. They take that long and those conditions because the carbon atoms that make them up need to be forced into an exceptionally tight crystalline lattice. Nature does this by burying graphite so deep and heating it so long that it has no other choice. And yet, in 1954, in a GE laboratory in Schenectady, New York, a group of 4 scientists did the same thing in an afternoon. Robert Wentorf Jr. was born in West Bend, Wisconsin, and studied chemistry at the University of Wisconsin. He joined GE's research laboratory in the early 1950s, at a moment when the laboratory was one of the most productive places in American science. The project he joined was called Project Superpressure. The name tells you what they were attempting and why it seemed improbable. The team included Tracy Hall, Francis Bundy, and Herbert Strong. Their shared goal was the controlled synthesis of diamond, a material with such extraordinary physical properties, hardness, heat conductivity, precision edge retention, that industrial demand for it was essentially unlimited. The problem was that nature's manufacturing process was, by definition, inaccessible. The team knew graphite was the key. Graphite and diamond are both pure carbon. The difference is entirely in how the carbon atoms are arranged. In graphite, the atoms are bonded in flat sheets that slide easily against each other, which is why graphite is soft enough to write with. In diamond, the atoms are bonded in a 3-dimensional lattice that nothing can penetrate, which is why diamond cuts everything else. The question was whether you could force graphite to rearrange itself. The answer was yes, if you applied enough pressure and enough heat. The problem was that graphite resisted change stubbornly. Its carbon bonds were strong enough to hold their configuration against reasonable assault. So Wentorf and the team added something the chemistry hadn't tried before: iron sulfide as a catalyst, to weaken the bonds just enough. They applied extreme pressure, they applied heat, and in December 1954, graphite became diamond in a laboratory for the first time in recorded history. GE announced the synthesis in 1955. The diamonds were small, chips really, suitable for industrial cutting and grinding rather than jewelry. But that was entirely the point. Today, more than 100 tons of synthetic diamonds are produced annually, over 450 million carats, and they're embedded in the tools that cut metal, drill through rock, grind precision components, and polish everything from semiconductor wafers to industrial mirrors. The diamond on the tip of a drill bit, the diamond in the edge of a surgical blade, the diamond coating on the lens grinder at an optometrist's laboratory, it's almost certainly synthetic, almost certainly descended from the chemistry that Wentorf and his colleagues worked out in Schenectady. Wentorf himself didn't stop there. Working from the same principles, he developed cubic boron nitride, a synthetic material that rivals diamond in hardness and surpasses it in heat resistance, making it useful in applications where diamond degrades at high temperatures. He spent his entire career at GE, retired in 1988, and went on to teach and research at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. The unexpected consequence runs underneath all of it. Wentorf and his team set out to replicate what the Earth does in 2 billion years. They succeeded in doing it in a pressure chamber in a few hours. What they discovered in doing so was that nature's most impenetrable material wasn't protected by the conditions that made it. It was simply protected by the assumption that those conditions couldn't be reproduced. Once you questioned that assumption and built the right tool, the diamond was already there in the graphite, waiting. The hardest thing in the world wasn't hard to make. It just needed the right kind of pressure, applied to the right material at the right moment. That's true of rather a lot of things. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means. Advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc. From tanker fire in the Hormuz to pressure deep enough to make diamonds. From the original confidence man's borrowed watch to an AI model asking if it can split rent. And from a labor market that beats but doesn't move to two economists who've been arguing about the price of your commute for decades. The pattern was simple. Look one layer down. Because first principles are rarely flashy.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you, to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai.
Until next time, stay curious.
Stay kind.
And keep compounding.